Hello, this is the Reverend Dr. David Chotka of Spirit Equipped Ministries. This is Resurrection Sunday. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. I want to talk to you about this whole notion of the resurrection. Some branches of the Lord's church have regarded it as an optional extra. And we can't do that if we want to be people who say that the New Testament is in fact the source of what we believe. In fact, the Apostle Paul names the conditions for salvation. And he says it this way in the book of Romans, chapter 10. It says this: if you confess with your mouth Jesus as Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, then you will be saved. It doesn't say that you can make any of those things an optional extra. It says that you have to believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead. And we have to hang on to that. We have to embrace it. We have to say that this is essential. We have to grab it. We have to cling to it. It needs to be nested in our hearts, and it needs to turn into action inside of our hearts and minds and souls and spirits. Now, the Corinthian church tried to throw out the resurrection. It's a crazy thing. They just didn't think they needed it. So Paul writes them and talks about the hope of the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. So let me just talk to you a little bit about what this means. Hope can be written out this way, like an acrostic: holding on, praying expectantly. Let me illustrate this. I found this illustration years ago in Leadership Magazine, and I've never, ever found a better one than this. So let me give credit where credit is due. But it's the story of a pilot by the name of Henry Dempsey. Now, Henry made the news a few years ago. You see, he was on a commuter trip from Portland, Maine to Boston, Massachusetts, and Henry Dempsey, the pilot, as the plane was taking off, heard an unusual noise at the rear of the small commuter aircraft. So he turned the controls over to his co-pilot and went back to see what it was. He wanted to check it out to make sure that all safety provisions were taken care of, etc. Just as he reached the tail section of the plane itself hit an air pocket. And of course, he was tossed, and Dempsey was tossed right against the rear door of the plane. And there he discovered the source of the mysterious noise. The rear door had not been properly latched prior to takeoff, and it absolutely flew open, and Dempsey was sucked right out of the jet. I mean, we're talking right out of the jet. Well, the co-pilot was sitting at the front of the plane, and of course there's instrument panels in front of him, and he sees a flashing red light indicating an open door. He radioed the nearest airport asking permission for a very fast landing, reporting that the pilot had fallen out of the plane. He then did what he had to do. He requested a helicopter search of that area of the ocean, but odds were that Dempsey had not survived. Well, the co-pilot managed to turn the plane to the nearest airport. He landed the plane safely. And as people were leaving the plane, they found Henry Dempsey holding on to the outdoor ladder of the aircraft. Somehow the fellow managed to catch the ladder as he was being sucked out of the jet, and he held on for 10 minutes as the plane flew 360 kilometers per hour, about 240 miles an hour, at an altitude of 4,000 feet. And then at the landing time, he managed to keep his head from hitting the runway just 12 inches away. 12 inches away while the plane landed on the runway. Now, it took airport personnel several minutes to pry Henry Dempsey's fingers away from that ladder. But let it never be said that Dempsey had a problem holding firm, because he knew that to let go would be to perish, and so he hung on, and he hung on for dear life. Now, let me just land this on Easter Sunday by reading to you from 1 Corinthians 15, verse 2, which is the resurrection chapter, where the apostle is telling the Corinthian church that if they don't hang on to the resurrection, they've lost their faith. He says this: by this gospel, you are saved if, I'm going to say it again. By this gospel, you are saved if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. And of course, that word included cross, which they had tossed out. And he talks about that in the beginning of that letter. And resurrection, which they had tossed out. And he brings the letter to a conclusion by talking about the importance of Jesus' bodily resurrection from the grave as an article of faith. Then he says this, otherwise, you believed in vain. I'm going to say the whole verse now. I want you to focus in on this. By this gospel you are saved if you hold firmly to the word I preach to you. Otherwise, you have believed in vain. Warnings from God are to be taken seriously. And so Paul tells the Corinthian church they most certainly need the cross. They most certainly need to know there was a literal burial. And they most certainly needed to embrace the fact that there was a literal and physical resurrection from the grave. And the command of the Bible is to hold on to the testimony of those who saw it and pray earnestly. And so Paul says this, without the resurrection, we're lost. Without the cross, we're lost. Without the two of them together, we don't understand suffering and glory. And we need to put all of those pieces together. And he says it beautifully in Romans, just as I said to you at the beginning of this little video, that if you believe in the heart and confess with the mouth, you'll be saved. You have to believe that Jesus is Lord to the glory of the Father, and you need to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. And those are articles of faith we can't abandon. Let me say this to you from the bottom of my heart. It is completely and totally true. And because Jesus entered into a human body and literally raised that body from the grave, your resurrection and mine is going to happen. All we need to do is to obey that if, hold firmly to the word that was preached to us by those first apostles, embrace it, and know how good God is. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. This is Reverend Dr. David Chotka on Resurrection Sunday morning, trusting and hoping that you will have a glorious day as you celebrate the goodness of God on this magnificent festival, set apart to remember how powerful is the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. If you want to receive weekly blogs, go to the Spirit Equipped webpage, www.spiritequipped.com. Click on the opt-in section, put your information there, and we'll send these out to you. May the Lord grant you great joy. Peace be with you.